Are you confident in the facts you learned back in school? I'm here to show you that the strongest walls of knowledge are built on foundations of fiction. We will open 30 doors, and behind each one lies a shock. The revelation of a myth you may still believe in. This won't be a dry list of facts. It will be a journey into the heart of misconceptions. Here, we'll see how legends were born, how they captivated the minds of millions, and why the real story is far stranger and more fascinating than any myth. Myth number 1, the smile of the ocean angel. Imagine the endless blue of the ocean, sunlight dancing on the crests of the waves, when suddenly a silhouette emerges from the depths, graceful, swift, adorned with an eternal, friendly smile. It's a dolphin. For centuries, we've woven its image into the tapestry of our brightest ideals about nature. It's the savior of drowning people, a wise friend to humans, a marine angel whose mere presence is a good omen. Thousands of stories told by sailors and travelers describe how pods of dolphins fend off sharks or push exhausted swimmers to the shore. We've watched movies where they play the roles of noble heroes and read books that place their intelligence on par with our own. This belief has been comforting, suggesting that even in the wild, untamed sea, there exists a haven of purity and altruism. We looked at their curved jaws and saw smiles. We heard their clicks and believed we were tuning in to friendly conversations. The myth of the dolphin savior has become an unchallenged axiom because a world with such a creature seems just a bit better and safer. But the archives hold other records, ones that smell of salt and concern, records that oceanographers and biologists kept hidden from the public eye for too long, fearing the collapse of this beautiful tale. The truth behind that smile is as cold as the ocean depths. The dolphin is no angel. It's one of the most efficient and sometimes ruthless predators in the ocean. Its behavior is driven not by kindness, but by complex instincts that can appear brutal to humans. The so-called rescue of drowning people, in most documented cases, is nothing more than playful behavior. To a dolphin, a human in the water is merely an intriguing floating object to nudge, toss around, and explore. Sometimes, this nudge accidentally guides a person to shore, but just as likely, it can lead them out into the open ocean. There have been recorded instances where dolphins, caught up in play, have caused serious injuries to humans or kept them submerged, preventing them from surfacing. Furthermore, these friendly creatures are known for their extreme aggression. Male dolphins may attack smaller marine mammals, like porpoises, not for food, but out of sheer aggression, battering them to death. They practice infanticide, killing calves to ensure the female is ready to mate again. Their social structure is complex, filled with conflicts, fights, and coercion. That eternal smile, which warms our hearts, is merely an anatomical feature of their jaw structure, unrelated to emotions as we understand them. The truth is that a dolphin is a wild, unpredictable, and incredibly intelligent creature, not a character from a children's fairy tale. While this truth might shatter our illusions, it offers something far more valuable in return: respect for their true, rather than imagined, nature. And as we say goodbye to one creature we've misrepresented, archives are already preparing the story of another, whose place on the tree of life we've entirely misunderstood. Myth number 2, the lost relative of the firefox. In the dense bamboo forests of the Himalayas, shrouded in mist that clings to the mountain slopes, a creature enveloped in mystery and confusion resides. We know it as the red panda. Take a look at it. A fluffy striped tail like that of a raccoon, a pointed snout, and fiery red fur. Its name echoes something large and monochrome, its famous relative, the giant panda. For centuries, people encountering this creature have tried to fit it into familiar frameworks. Travelers have described it as the fire fox. Zoologists, who first received its pelt in the 19th century, debated for a long time about its classification. It was easiest to conclude that it was either some odd species of raccoon due to its external similarities, or simply a small version of the giant panda, with which it shares both habitat and a love for bamboo. This myth of their kinship has taken root so deeply that even today, in popular articles and some documentaries, they are placed side by side as cousins. We are accustomed to thinking that nature creates families that make sense to us. Here are felids, there are bears, and here are raccoons. And the red panda seemed destined to find its place in one of these boxes, yet it stubbornly refuses to fit into any. Now, let me open the box labeled Secrets of Classification. The truth is that the red panda is neither a panda nor a raccoon. This creature is so unique that it is the last surviving member of an entire distinct family, Ailuridae. Imagine a vast tree of life, where strong branches extend from a central trunk: bears, raccoons, martens. The family of red pandas represents a separate, ancient branch that diverged from a common ancestor of carnivores tens of millions of years ago. All its relatives have long since gone extinct, leaving just this one small orange creature on Earth. It is a living fossil, a solitary time traveler carrying in its DNA the history of a world we will never see. Its resemblance to a raccoon is the result of convergent evolution, where different species acquire similar traits while adapting to similar conditions. Its only connection to the giant panda lies in the name that Europeans bestowed upon it and its diet. Genetically, the giant panda is a bear, while the red panda is a red panda, one of a kind. The myth of its relatives arose from our human desire to simplify and categorize everything. But nature doesn't always play by our rules. Sometimes she creates a masterpiece and leaves it as a unique reminder that not all mysteries can be neatly categorized. The red panda is not a missing link, it is an entire broken chain. The realization of this solitude is far more striking than any fabricated lineage. From this lonely creature in the mountains, we will shift our focus to two others, whom our imagination stubbornly tries to connect across icy expanses, even though their meeting in nature is impossible. Myth number 3. The unmet encounter at the top of the world. Close your eyes and picture the perfect winter landscape. Expanses of pure white, icy ridges sparkling under the cold sun. Now, fill this scene with its most iconic inhabitants. Who comes to mind? Of course, the majestic polar bear, the ruler of the Arctic, and the amusing, clumsy penguin in its pristine tuxedo. For decades, this duo has become inseparable in our cultural narrative. They appear together on Christmas cards, in cartoons, on candy wrappers, and in commercials. Their images have merged into a single symbol of eternal cold and polar life. It seems entirely natural to us that a hungry polar bear could hunt a colony of penguins. This image is so firmly embedded in our minds that the question, "Why don't polar bears eat penguins?" has become a popular riddle for children. We believed in this myth because it created a harmonious, albeit brutal, ecosystem in our imagination. It simplified the world by reducing all the icy deserts of our planet to one common denominator, to a single pole where these two creatures simply had to meet. But now it's time to look at a globe and realize the absurdity of this picture. The greatest revelation of this myth lies not in biology or animal behavior, but in simple, relentless geography. Polar bears are inhabitants of the North Pole, the Arctic. Their world consists of the drifting ice of the Arctic Ocean, the shores of Greenland, Canada, and Russia. Penguins, on the other hand, are found in the southern hemisphere. Most live in Antarctica, at the South Pole, while some species can even be found along the coasts of South America, Africa, and Australia. They are separated not just by several thousand kilometers of water, but by an entire planet. They inhabit opposite ends of the Earth and would never meet in the wild, under any circumstances. A polar bear has never seen a penguin, and a penguin has never seen a polar bear. This myth is a vivid illustration of how our imagination creates its own worlds while ignoring reality. We have combined the two most charismatic cold-dwelling animals into one story because it was simpler and more beautiful that way. The truth is that the Arctic and Antarctica are two completely different, isolated worlds. The Arctic has bears but no penguins. The Antarctic has penguins but no large terrestrial predators like bears, which allowed them to evolve into flightless birds. This unfulfilled encounter is not a quirk of nature, but a fundamental law of planetary geography. And while this imagined meeting at the poles of the world may seem like a harmless fantasy, the next myth we will explore is born from a real, sticky fear that makes us cover our ears at night and recoil in horror from the most ordinary insects. Myth number 4. The nightmare whispering in your ear. There are fears that are passed down in whispers, in the dim light of children's rooms or around a campfire at night. They may not be found in textbooks, but they reside in our memories far more firmly than any scientific truth. One such fear is linked to a small, unremarkable insect with menacing pincers at the end of its body, the earwig. The very name itself sounds like a curse in Russian and many other languages. The legend says that this creature of the night has a sinister habit. While you sleep, it crawls into your ear canal, burrowing deep into your brain to lay its eggs. This image is so horrifying, so primal, that it paralyzes the will. It preys on our fear of vulnerability in sleep, of intrusion into our most sacred space, our minds. For centuries, this myth has been passed down from generation to generation as an undeniable truth, a warning. People slept outside with trepidation, and mothers checked their children's ears, while the very word earwig became synonymous with something disgusting and invasive. The belief in this myth was absolute, as it explained both the frightening name of the insect and its secretive nocturnal lifestyle. It was the perfect monster for a scary story, small, ubiquitous, and targeting the most defenseless spot. However, when we turn on the light of reason and science, this nightmarish tale dissipates like smoke. The truth is that this entire story is 100% urban legend, with absolutely no basis in reality. Yes, like any other small insect, an earwig could theoretically crawl into the ear of a sleeping person, mistaking it for a cozy, dark refuge. But that's where any connection to the myth ends. First of all, its pincers, or cerci, are not designed for burrowing into flesh. They are used for defense, holding prey, and folding wings. They cannot bore through an eardrum or the bones of the skull. The path to the brain is physically closed off to them. Secondly, and most importantly, earwigs do not lay eggs in living creatures. They are caring mothers that build nests in damp soil or under tree bark and diligently protect their brood. The idea of laying eggs in someone else's brain is as absurd for them as it is for a bird to build a nest underwater. This myth likely originated in medieval Europe from a superstitious fear of everything that crawls and hides in the dark, reinforced by their ominous name. In reality, earwigs are harmless insects that play their role in the ecosystem. They pose no more danger than any other beetle or spider that might wander into your home. But the myth turned out to be stronger than the truth because it appeals not to logic, but to deep, irrational fear. And as we leave this fictional horror behind, our next archival document will tell the story of a man whose teachings were transformed into a religion, even though he never considered himself a prophet. Myth number 5, the prophet who wasn't a prophet. Throughout human history, there are names that resonate like bells, heralding entire eras and civilizations. One such name is Confucius. For millions in the West, and even for many in the East, his figure is shrouded in the aura of a religious founder, a prophet who established a teaching akin to Buddhism or Christianity. We envision temples erected in his honor, rituals performed by his followers, and sacred texts viewed as divine revelation. This image of Confucius as the founder of Confucianism as a religion has become so ingrained in the collective consciousness that it feels unshakable. We speak of Confucianism as one of the world religions, placing it alongside other great faiths. We believe this because it simplifies the complex landscape of Chinese thought, reducing it to a familiar model. There was a founder, he brought forth a teaching, and from it arose a religion. This convenient and clear framework seemingly explains the immense influence this person had on the history of China and all of East Asia. But if we delve into the scrolls written during the Zhou dynasty, we'll find a very different person. The real Kongzi, or Master Kong, who lived over 2,500 years ago, never considered himself the founder of a religion. He was a philosopher, a thinker, a government official, and above all, an educator. He didn't concern himself with questions of the afterlife, creation myths, or the nature of deities. When his students asked him about spirits, he replied, "How can one serve spirits without first learning to serve people?" His teachings were entirely focused on earthly life, how to build a just and harmonious society, how a noble man should behave, and what the relationships between father and son, ruler and subject should be. He spoke of ethics, ritual, humanity, and duty. He didn't preach, he engaged in dialogue. He didn't create dogmas, he encouraged reflection. The transformation of Confucius into an object of religious veneration began only several centuries after his passing, during the Han Dynasty. It was then that emperors, seeking ideological support for their power, took his philosophy, systematized it, and turned it into a state cult. Temples were built, mandatory rituals for worshipping his spirit were established, and his writings became canon, requiring memorization. Thus, it was not Confucius who created a religion, but rather an empire that formed a religion from his name and teachings, often distorting their original meaning. He was a sage, seeking harmony in the human world, yet he was transformed into a deity prayed to for earthly goods. This myth conceals a fundamental difference between a philosophy aimed at improving this world and a religion that looks to an otherworldly realm. From the wisdom of a master whose legacy was rewritten, we now shift to an emperor whose reforms have generated equally enduring, yet equally inaccurate myths. Myth number 6. Coffee beans and the shaved chins of the empire. Lofty above the history of Russia, like a bronze horseman above the Neva waves, stands the figure of Peter I. His image in the public memory is forged from resolute, almost caricatured traits. He is the carpenter czar, the reforming czar, who cut a window to Europe with a single stroke. Among the many myths surrounding his reign, two have particularly taken root. The first is that it was Peter who forced the backward Russian boyars to drink coffee, imposing this European beverage by decree. The second is that the main symbol of his Europeanization was the forced shaving of beards, which he allegedly carried out himself with an axe in hand. These two scenes, the boyar grimacing while sipping the bitter drink, and the other tearfully saying goodbye to his bushy beard, have become the essence of Peter's reforms in the collective consciousness. We believe in these myths because they are vivid, dramatic, and simple. They reduce complex social and cultural transformations to two easy, almost anecdotal actions. They portray Peter as a sort of barbaric, enlightened ruler, dragging his country into the future by its beards and serving civilization from a coffee cup. However, if we turn to archival decrees and accounts from contemporaries, the picture is much more complicated and interesting. Let's start with coffee. This drink did indeed arrive in Russia during Peter's era, but it was not a tool for mass cultural reform. Peter and his circle did drink coffee, but it remained an exotic and expensive pleasure for a small circle of aristocrats. The widespread adoption of coffee in Russia began much later, in the second half of the 18th century, under Catherine II. The myth of forcing coffee down people's throats is a grand exaggeration born from a desire to emphasize the radical nature of Peter's innovations. As for beards, here, truth and fiction are more closely intertwined. Peter did issue a decree on beard shaving in 1698, and it was a shocking blow to traditional norms. For a Russian man of that time, a beard was not just a decoration, but a symbol of faith, masculine honor, and dignity. However, the famous scenes where the Tsar personally wields an axe or scissors pertain only to a few initial, exemplary actions taken to intimidate the most stubborn. The main instrument of reform was not the axe but the economy. A special tax on beards was introduced. Anyone who wished to keep their beard had to pay a hefty fee and wear a special copper token, the beard kopeck. Thus, shaving beards was not simply the whim of a czar, but part of a broader reform aimed at visually separating the new service nobility from the old aristocracy and the common people, as well as replenishing the treasury. The myth simplified this multifaceted measure to an act of mere violence, overlooking its social and financial context. Peter's reforms were not a series of anecdotes. Rather, they were a complicated and painful process, and the true drama of his era runs much deeper than the myths of coffee and beards. From one great reformer, whose activities have become legendary, we will now shift to another era and another continent, to a man whom history remembers as the sole leader of a great movement, though in reality, he was just its most prominent voice. Myth number 7. The lone voice of revolution. When we hear the words civil rights struggle in the United States, one image, one voice, one name immediately comes to mind: Martin Luther King Jr. His speech, "I Have a Dream," delivered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, became the anthem for an entire generation. His figure, pastor, preacher of nonviolent resistance, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and a victim of an assassin's bullet, has been canonized and transformed into an icon. The story we often hear sounds like a tale of a single hero. It seems he led millions by himself, that it was his ideas and sacrifices that brought about the end of segregation and the passage of key civil rights laws. This myth of the lone leader is convenient. It gives the movement a face, a symbol, a clear and inspiring story of how one great person can change the world. We believe this because it aligns with the classic heroic narrative we are so accustomed to. But the truth, as it often is much more complex and accurately honors many forgotten names. Martin Luther King was undoubtedly an outstanding and pivotal figure, but he was not the only leader of the movement. He was more of its most prominent and charismatic representative, its voice heard around the world. In reality, the civil rights movement was a vast, branching network of organizations and activists, each playing their own role and holding their own ideologies. There was Rosa Parks, whose courageous "No" on a Montgomery bus in 1955 sparked a wave of mass protests. There was Malcolm X, whose radical, fiery nationalism and calls for self-defense represented a powerful alternative to King's philosophy of nonviolence. There was A. Philip Randolph, a veteran of the labor movement, who organized marches on Washington long before King. There were thousands of unnamed students staging sit-ins at diners, activists registering voters in the Deep South, risking their lives. The movement was polyphonic, filled with different voices and fierce debates over tactics and strategies. Focusing solely on Dr. King not only diminishes the contributions of hundreds of other leaders and thousands of grassroots participants, but also simplifies the movement itself, reducing it to a single ideology. King became its symbol due to his incredible oratory skills, moral authority, and tragically, his martyrdom. Yet, behind him stood an entire army of heroes, whose names history must not forget. Now, from a man whose death largely contributed to his legend, we move to another great figure, whose final days and the reason for his departure from life have also been victims of a persistent and humiliating myth. Myth number 8. Final Days in the Shadow of Shame. Oscar Wilde. This name is synonymous with brilliant wit, aestheticism, genius, and tragedy. His life was a work of art, and his fall, a Greek drama playing out in the foggy London of the late 19th century. And when it comes to his death, one dark picture arises in the public mind. The great writer, broken and disgraced, dies in poverty in a cheap Paris hotel from syphilis, a shameful disease that, at the time, was viewed as a punishment for a dissolute lifestyle. This myth has become the final, cruel note in his tragic fate. It fits perfectly into Victorian morality. A genius who defied societal laws was punished not only with prison, but also with a painful and humiliating death. This version of his end was so convincing because it offered a moral conclusion. It turned a complex human drama into a simple parable about sin and retribution, a conclusion that satisfied many who judged Wilde during his life. However, medical records and testimonies from friends who were with him until his last breath tell a very different story. Oscar Wilde did not die of syphilis. He passed away in November 1900 from acute meningitis. The meningitis, in turn, was caused by complications from chronic ear infection, otitis media, which had troubled him for many years and worsened after a fall in prison. Just weeks before his death, he even underwent surgery on his ear, but, unfortunately, it did not help. As for syphilis, there is no reliable medical evidence that he suffered from the disease in its later stages. This rumor was likely spread by his enemies and picked up by biographers who sought sensationalism and drama. Yes, Wilde's final years were spent in poverty and exile. After his release from prison, he was destitute and abandoned by many, but not all. He had loyal friends who supported him, both financially and morally. And he was not completely forgotten. His works, albeit under pseudonyms, continued to be published. The myth of dying from syphilis is a posthumous slander, a stain cast upon his memory to make his tragedy even more instructive for a hypocritical society. In reality, his passing was a result of unfortunate medical circumstances, not divine retribution. From the tragedy of one man whose legacy was distorted, we turn to the legacy of an entire civilization, embodied in stone, whose fate changed as dramatically as the lives around it. Myth number 9. The Marble Temple of 1,000 Lives. When we think of the Parthenon in Athens, a majestic, ideal picture arises in our imagination. The shining white marble, slender columns, perfect proportions. It is a symbol of ancient Greece, the cradle of democracy and philosophy, a temple dedicated to the warrior goddess Athena. We see it as an untouched monument of one era, one cult, one people. In our minds, it stands frozen in its pristine splendor, an everlasting monument to classical antiquity. This myth of the pure ancient temple is sustained by countless reproductions, history textbooks, and tourist postcards. We want to believe that this structure has carried its singular, original essence through the millennia, that it has always been home to the goddess of wisdom and nothing else. This belief is comforting. It creates a sense of permanence and a connection to humanity's golden age. However, the true Parthenon is not a static monument but a living organism, its body marked by the scars of history, and its soul evolving along with the beliefs of the people who have lived at its feet. Its story after the fall of the ancient world is a captivating and tragic narrative. Yes, it was built in the 5th century BCE as a temple for Athena, but that was only its first incarnation. With the arrival of Christianity around the 6th century CE, it was transformed into a Christian church dedicated to the Virgin Mary, the Cathedral of the Blessed Virgin of Athens. Its interior was altered, pagan sculptures were destroyed or removed, and frescoes depicting saints adorned the walls. For nearly 1,000 years, it stood as one of the most significant Orthodox cathedrals of the Byzantine Empire. Then, in the 15th century, Athens was conquered by the Ottoman Empire, and the history of the temple took another turn. It became a mosque. A minaret was added, and Christian symbols were replaced with Islamic ones. It stood this way for another 200 years. The most terrible tragedy occurred in 1687, during a war between the Venetians and the Turks. The Ottomans, defending the Acropolis, naively turned the Parthenon into a gunpowder store, believing the Christian Venetians would never dare fire upon a building that was once a church. They were wrong. A Venetian cannonball struck the store, causing a devastating explosion that destroyed the central part of the temple, leaving us with the ruins we see today. Thus, the Parthenon was not only a pagan temple, but also a Christian church, a Muslim mosque, and ultimately a military fortress and ammunition depot. Its history reflects the tumultuous past of the Mediterranean. The myth of the eternal temple of Athena conceals this remarkable and dramatic biography, filled with transformations and losses. From one ancient structure whose story has been rewritten, we will set out to discover the oldest city in the world and find that this title is fiercely contested. Myth number 10. The race for the title of Cradle of Civilization. In history, there are titles that sound like absolute truths. One of them is Damascus, the oldest continuously inhabited city on Earth. This phrase can be heard from guides, read in travel books, and found in encyclopedias. It creates the image of a patriarchal city that has witnessed the birth and death of empires, heard languages long turned to dust, and holds within its stones the memory of all humanity. The legend of Damascus as the oldest city is supported by references to the Bible and archaeological findings that attest to settlements in this oasis for millennia. We readily embrace this myth because it provides us with a reference point, a historical anchor from which we can measure the age of other cities. He brings order to the chaotic timeline of human civilization, granting one location an exceptional, almost sacred status. However, when archaeologists and historians begin to synchronize their watches, this unshakable truth begins to waver. The reality is that the title of the oldest continuously inhabited city is not a scientific fact, but rather a point of pride and heated debate. Damascus is undoubtedly among the oldest cities. Evidence suggests that a settlement existed there as far back as 10,000 years before Christ, but proof of continuous habitation over all this time is quite murky, especially during certain periods, and it faces some very serious competitors. For instance, the Palestinian city of Jericho. Archaeological excavations there have uncovered remnants of settlements over 11,000 years old, including the famous Jericho Tower, one of the oldest stone structures in the world. Another contender is the Lebanese city of Byblos, which has been a major port and city for at least 7,000 years without any evident interruption. One cannot overlook Aleppo in Syria, which, before the recent tragic events, also claimed a continuous history stretching back several millennia. The problem lies in the very definition. What qualifies as a city? What counts as continuous habitation? If a small village existed at the site before it expanded back into a city, does that count as continuity? Due to these complexities and the incompleteness of archaeological data, no scholar can confidently declare one of these cities the oldest. Damascus is one of the patriarchs, but to call it the only and oldest is to ignore its equally ancient counterparts. The myth of its unique status arises from the desire for a simple and definitive answer to a complex historical question. But history rarely offers such answers. From the ancient cities of the Middle East, we will now move to the heart of Russia, to a fortress whose image, in the minds of many, has been unfairly reduced to its outer walls. Myth number 11. The Red Walls Hiding the City. For hundreds of millions around the world, the word Kremlin evokes the same vivid image: massive, crenellated red brick walls topped with tall towers adorned with ruby stars. It is a symbol of Russia, synonymous with its power, a formidable and impregnable fortress showcased in news reports. In the minds of many, especially outside the country, the Kremlin is simply these walls and towers. It is perceived as a single, monolithic defensive structure within which lie various government buildings. This myth of the Kremlin as merely the walls is remarkably persistent, as its iconic appearance overshadows everything else. It has become a visual cliché, so easy to reproduce and grasp that few pause to consider what truly lies behind these red walls. In reality, the Moscow Kremlin is not just a fortress, it's a whole city within a city, a complex architectural and historical ensemble that has developed over many centuries. The walls and towers are merely its exterior shell, its box. Inside lies true treasure. At the heart of the Kremlin is Cathedral Square, home to three magnificent cathedrals: the Assumption Cathedral, where Russian czars were crowned, the Archangel Cathedral, their burial place, and the Annunciation Cathedral, their home church. Nearby stands the Ivan the Great Bell Tower, which for centuries has been the tallest building in Moscow. Here you'll also find the Faceted Chamber, the oldest banquet hall, and the Grand Kremlin Palace, the former residence of emperors. The Senate building is located here as well, where the president's office is situated today. Additionally, there's the Armory Chamber, a treasury that holds the cap of Monomakh, royal regalia, armor, and carriages. The Kremlin is the spiritual, historical, and political center of the country, where epochs and styles intertwine, from ancient Russian architecture to classicism and Soviet empire. Reducing it to just its walls is like judging a book by its cover without opening it. This myth narrows our understanding of one of the world's most significant historical complexes, turning a vibrant, multifaceted museum city into a flat backdrop. Now, from the symbol of Moscow, let's move to the symbol of Paris, which is also surrounded by myth, but a myth of salvation that doesn't entirely match reality. Myth number 12, the Iron Lady, saved by war. There's a story that Parisian guides love to tell. It's a romantic tale of love and art. When Gustave Eiffel built his famous tower for the World's Fair in 1889, the Parisians hated it. The city's elite, writers and artists, wrote furious petitions calling it useless and monstrous, a tragic street lamp. The tower was intended to be a temporary structure, scheduled to be dismantled in 20 years. And here is where the myth begins. The legend claims that over those 20 years, Parisians gradually fell in love with its delicate silhouette. They grew accustomed to it, and it became an integral part of the cityscape. It was this public affection and the protests of citizens that saved it from demolition. This story is wonderful. It flatters Parisians and all those in love with this city. It asserts the triumph of aesthetic feelings over pragmatism, turning the tower into a monument of the people's will. We believe in this because it is a beautiful, inspiring tale. But the truth, as often is the case, is far more prosaic and pragmatic. The love of Parisians undoubtedly played a role, but it was not the deciding factor. The Eiffel Tower was saved not by romance but by science and war. Gustave Eiffel was not only a brilliant engineer, but also a shrewd businessman. Understanding that his creation was at risk of being dismantled, he actively sought practical purposes for it. From the very beginning, a meteorological laboratory and a physics study were established at the top of the tower. But the greatest salvation for her was the invention of the radio. The tower became the perfect, tallest radio antenna in the world at that time. In the early 20th century, the first experiments in wireless telegraphy were conducted from it. As World War I approached, its strategic importance became invaluable. From the tower, the French army could intercept enemy radio communications, giving them a significant advantage. For instance, in 1914, it was precisely the intercepted radio messages from the tower that provided information about the advance of German troops, leading to a counteroffensive that entered history as the Miracle on the Marne and saved Paris. After that, the idea of demolishing the tower was permanently abandoned. It proved its indispensability not as a work of art, but as a strategically important military and scientific establishment. So the life of the Iron Lady of Paris is owed not so much to the enthusiastic sighs of poets, but to the stern voice of the military telegraph. From this man-made symbol, whose fate was decided by technology, we now turn to the forces of nature itself, whose destructive actions we often understand too narrowly. Myth number 13. Fire, the giver of life. In our minds, a forest fire is absolute evil, an undeniable disaster. We see news footage of blazing forests, fleeing animals, and charred, blackened earth. It seems that fire is the enemy of the forest, destroying all life and leaving behind only death and desolation. This picture is so dramatic and clear-cut that we've come to regard any forest fire as a tragedy that must be prevented at all costs. The myth of the 100% harm from forest fires has taken root thanks to the efforts of environmental agencies, which have pursued a policy of total fire suppression for decades. We believed this because it seemed logical. Fire burns trees, so it must be harmful. However, this simple logic conceals the complex and paradoxical truth about the life of the forest. The truth that ecologists only recognized in the latter half of the 20th century is that, for many ecosystems, fire is not an enemy, but a vital and necessary element, a sort of sanitary measure and catalyst for renewal. Many forests, especially coniferous ones and savannas, have evolved over millions of years under conditions of periodic lightning-caused fires. They didn't just adapt to fire, they became dependent on it. So, what does a beneficial fire do? Firstly, it clears the forest of dead wood, fallen branches, and diseased underbrush, preventing the accumulation of flammable material that could lead to a much more destructive crown fire. It acts like a vaccination, triggering a small controlled inflammation to avert a deadly disease. Secondly, the ashes left after a fire fertilize the soil, returning valuable minerals back into it. Thirdly, and perhaps most astonishingly, for many plants, fire is a signal to reproduce. For example, the cones of certain pine species, such as the Banksia pine, are so tightly sealed with resin that they can only open and release seeds when exposed to high temperatures. Without fire, these trees would simply be unable to reproduce. The policy of total fire suppression during the 20th century resulted in a paradox. Vast amounts of dead wood accumulated in forests. When wildfires eventually occurred, they became catastrophic, destroying even those trees that could have survived the typical ground fire. Today, ecologists are rethinking their approach to fire, recognizing that sometimes the best course of action is to let nature take its course. Now, turning from earthly fire, let's discuss heavenly fire, an occurrence surrounded by seasonal misconceptions. Myth number 14. The heavenly lights of polar nights. When we mention the northern lights, or aurora borealis, a picture forms in our minds of a long, frosty polar night. We envision snowy landscapes in places like Norway or Alaska, with green, purple, and pink bursts dancing in the ink-black sky above. This image is so powerful that it has led to a persistent myth. The aurora is a phenomenon exclusive to winter, visible only during the darkest, coldest time of the year. Tourists plan their trips for the aurora season from December to February, while photographers bundle up, eagerly anticipating the celestial spectacle. We believe this because our own experience tells us that the darker the sky, the better we can see stars and other celestial phenomena. It seems logical that ideal conditions of darkness, provided only by winter, are necessary for the aurora as well. However, the physics of this phenomenon doesn't adhere to our earthly seasons. The truth is that the northern lights occur year-round, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's a continuous process. It is caused by streams of charged particles from the sun, known as solar wind, interacting with Earth's magnetic field and upper layers of the atmosphere. This solar activity does not depend on whether it's winter or summer here on Earth. The lights are always present over the poles, so why do we mainly see them in winter? The answer is humorously simple, because only in winter do the polar regions have enough darkness to see them. During summer in the Arctic, the polar day takes place when the sun doesn't set below the horizon for weeks, sometimes even months. Against a bright or twilight sky, the relatively dim glow of the aurora cannot be discerned, just as we can't see stars during the day. The aurora doesn't vanish, it simply gets drowned out by sunlight. In winter, however, polar night occurs, and the dark sky becomes an ideal canvas for this cosmic artist for many hours. Therefore, the seasonality of the northern lights is not a physical characteristic of the phenomenon itself, but rather a feature of observing it from Earth's surface. It does not originate in winter, it simply becomes visible to us. Now, from this celestial phenomenon we wrongly associate with seasons, let's turn to a geological occurrence, to a volcano whose story, as many believe, ended with one catastrophic eruption. Myth number 15. The ghost of the volcano rising from the ashes. In the annals of natural disasters, one name echoes like the roar of hell itself: Krakatoa. Its eruption in 1883 was one of the most powerful and devastating in modern history. The explosion was heard thousands of kilometers away, triggering gigantic tsunamis that claimed the lives of tens of thousands. The ash released into the atmosphere altered the global climate for years. This catastrophe was so monumental that it completely overshadowed the rest of the volcano's history. In the collective mindset, Krakatoa is a volcano that erupted once, in 1883, and then ceased to exist. We imagine it left only a gaping hole in the ocean, an underwater caldera serving as an eternal monument to its fury. The myth of the dead Krakatoa is convenient. It places a definitive end to this horrifying narrative, transforming the volcano into a past event, a historical fact that no longer poses a threat. But nature abhors a vacuum, especially in geologically active areas. The truth is far more alarming and fascinating. After the eruption of 1883, which truly obliterated much of the island housing the volcano, Krakatoa did not die. It simply went dormant. Volcanic activity in that region did not cease. By 1927, less than 50 years after the disaster, sailors began spotting columns of smoke and ash rising from the water at the center of the caldera left by the old volcano. From the ocean depths, a new volcanic cone began to form. Local residents named it Anak Krakatau, which translates from Indonesian as Child of Krakatoa. And this child turned out to be quite restless. Throughout the 20th century and into the early 21st, Anak Krakatau steadily grew, erupted, and changed shape. It regularly spewed columns of ash and unleashed lava flows, reminding us of the immense power lying beneath. In 2018, another major eruption occurred, causing part of the cone to collapse into the sea, triggering a deadly tsunami. So, Krakatoa is not just alive. It has risen from the ashes in the form of its offspring, which continues to thrive and poses a serious threat to the region. The myth of the sleeping giant conceals from us the astonishing truth about the ongoing cycle of destruction and creation that occurs at volcanic hotspots around our planet. And from volcano-related catastrophes, we shift to other tremors of the Earth that many mistakenly believe occur only in certain locations. Myth number 16. Earthquakes in unexpected places. Ask any schoolchild where earthquakes occur, and they will likely respond confidently, at tectonic plate boundaries. We are shown maps with these boundaries marked in red lines, and it is along these lines that the most seismically active zones in the world are located: the Ring of Fire, Japan, California, Chile. This model is simple, clear, and logical. We envision the Earth's crust as a mosaic of large plates that grind against each other, collide, and drift apart. It is at their edges that immense energy is released, causing the ground to shake. The myth that earthquakes only occur at plate boundaries is so deeply entrenched in our minds that reports of tremors far from these zones cause surprise and confusion. We tend to believe that if you live in the heart of a continent, away from geological faults, you are completely safe. However, our planet is a much more complex system than a simple mosaic. The truth is that destructive earthquakes, although much rarer, can and do occur in the seemingly stable areas deep within tectonic plates. This phenomenon is known as intraplate seismicity. Stress within the plate can accumulate along ancient, hidden faults left over from long past geological eras. These scars on the plate can suddenly come alive due to stresses that propagate thousands of kilometers from its active boundaries. A striking and terrifying example of such an event is the series of massive earthquakes that struck during the winter of 1811 to 1812 in the region of New Madrid, Missouri, right in the heart of the North American plate. The tremors were so powerful that they were felt across much of modern-day USA, momentarily causing the Mississippi River to flow backward and ringing church bells in Boston, over 1,500 kilometers from the epicenter. If an earthquake of such magnitude were to occur in this densely populated area today, the consequences would be catastrophic. These events prove that no corner of our planet is completely shielded from the wrath of the Earth. The myth of safety within continents creates a false sense of security, while geological history reminds us that the ground can shake where you least expect it. From the mysteries hidden in the Earth's crust, we now turn to the secrets concealed within our own bodies and minds, exploring how intelligence is connected to our health. Myth number 17, genius, immune to illness. In our culture, there exists a steadfast, almost reverent attitude toward high intelligence. We view people with high IQs as a sort of superhumans whose sharp minds seem to provide them with advantages in all areas of life. From this admiration has emerged a tempting myth that people with high IQs live longer and suffer from illnesses less frequently. This idea appears quite logical. A smart person is more likely to understand the principles of a healthy lifestyle, analyze medical information effectively, earn a higher income, which gives access to quality healthcare, and manage stress better due to developed cognitive abilities. It seems that intelligence acts as a universal shield, protecting one from both foolish decisions and diseases. We believe in this myth because it supports our faith in justice. Intelligence is rewarded with a long and healthy life. However, when scientists and statisticians start to examine this issue, they see not a straightforward path, but a tangled web of connections. The truth is that there is no proven direct causal link between high IQ and longevity. Yes, statistics show a positive correlation. On average, people with higher intelligence scores tend to live a bit longer. But, as always, the devil is in the details. What is the cause and what is the effect? A high IQ is not a magic pill that strengthens the immune system or repairs cells by itself. Instead, it is likely one of the factors that influences other, more crucial variables. For example, people with high IQs often receive better education, and better education leads to higher paying, less dangerous jobs, better access to healthcare, and healthier habits, like a lower percentage of smokers. In other words, it's not intelligence itself that affects longevity, but rather the entire complex of socioeconomic factors and lifestyle choices that are often associated, though not always, with it. Moreover, some studies suggest that people with exceptionally high IQs may be more prone to certain psychological disorders, such as anxiety or depression, which do not promote health. The myth of IQ as a cure-all is dangerous because it oversimplifies the complex system of factors influencing our health and creates an unfair hierarchy where the intelligent are presumed to be better on a biological level. But from these unseen processes in our bodies, we turn to medical technologies that we can see, yet often misunderstand in terms of how they work. Myth number 18. Invisible rays of the magnetic field. In today's world, medical diagnostics have come a long way, and one of the most powerful tools has become tomography. However, for most patients who are far from physics, all these complex machines merge into a single frightening entity. From this misunderstanding has emerged a widespread and very persistent myth that MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging, uses radiation, just like X-rays or CT scans. Many people fear this procedure, believing it exposes their body to harmful radiation, and they approach referrals from doctors with caution, especially if multiple scans are needed. This fear is fueled by the machine's appearance, the large tunnel that hums and clicks, into which the patient is entirely placed. All of this creates an impression of significant, almost nuclear intervention in the body. The myth about radiation in MRI persists because it taps into a general anxiety about invisible and potentially harmful radiation, which we tend to associate with advanced medicine. But here we encounter a fundamental misconception based on confusion over terminology and technology. The truth is that MRI has absolutely nothing to do with radiation, that is, ionizing radiation. Its principle of operation is based on completely different physical phenomena. Inside an MRI machine, a very powerful yet completely harmless magnetic field is created. This field causes protons and hydrogen atoms, which primarily make up our bodies, since we are mostly water, to align in a specific order, like tiny compass needles. Then the machine sends short radio frequency pulses, essentially radio waves, into the body, which knock these protons out of alignment. When the pulse stops, the protons return to their original position, emitting a weak radio signal in the process. This response signal is captured by the machine's detectors, and a computer uses it to create incredibly detailed, layered images of the internal organs, particularly soft tissues. Thus, in an MRI, you are only affected by the magnetic field and radio waves which surround us in everyday life, from radio stations or mobile phones, and do not have enough energy to damage cells. Radiation, that is, X-rays, is used in another procedure, CT, or computed tomography. Confusing these two methods, people often carry justified concerns about radiation and apply them to the completely safe procedure of MRI. Now, leaving fears about medical machines behind, let's move on to more common but no less dangerous misconceptions related to the summer sun. Myth number 19. The crimson kiss of the sun will heal itself. Summer, sunshine, the beach. We all love this time and strive to get a nice tan. But sometimes the enthusiasm for sunbathing ends sadly. Skin turns red, hurts, and burns. Sunburn. In our society, there is quite a frivolous attitude towards this phenomenon. A common myth states that sunburn is unpleasant but not dangerous, and that it will heal on its own, requiring just a little patience or some cream to soothe the skin. We perceive it as a temporary cosmetic flaw, an annoying but unavoidable part of summer fun. This belief in the harmlessness of sunburns is quite convenient, allowing us not to worry too much about sun protection and not to seek medical help for what seems like a trivial matter. We think, well, I got burned. In a couple of days, the skin will peel and everything will be fine. However, dermatologists and oncologists are sounding the alarm because behind this lighthearted myth lies a serious health threat. The truth is that sunburn is not just redness. It is a radiation burn caused by ultraviolet radiation, which damages the DNA in skin cells. When the skin reddens and becomes inflamed, it is a reaction from the immune system trying to eliminate damaged cells that could potentially become cancerous. Peeling skin a few days later is the process of rejecting dead, damaged layers of the epidermis. Yes, a mild burn really does heal on its own, in the sense that the external symptoms disappear. But each such damage leaves a mark in the memory of the skin. Cells with damaged DNA that survive can potentially lead to the development of melanoma or other types of skin cancer in the future. The risk is cumulative. The more sunburns you experience throughout your life, especially in childhood, the higher your chances of developing cancer later on. Severe sunburns characterized by blisters and elevated temperatures require immediate medical attention as they can lead to dehydration and secondary infections. Thus, The myth that sunburns are harmless is a dangerous misconception that causes us to neglect our own health. It is not just a temporary discomfort, but a genuine risk factor for one of the most aggressive forms of cancer. From one red topic, we move to another, linked to a popular myth about foods that supposedly instantaneously improve the composition of our blood. Myth number 20, the bloody color of health. In the realm of folk medicine and grandmother's advice, there exists a whole category of foods attributed with almost magical properties. One of the most persistent myths in this area is related to boosting hemoglobin levels. The legend tells us that if you have low hemoglobin or anemia, you need to eat more red foods, beets, pomegranates, and red meat, as they will almost instantly raise your iron levels in the blood. This belief is especially strong when it comes to beet juice. Its deep blood red color seems to be direct evidence of its effectiveness. The logic is simple. The product is red, like blood, so it must be good for the blood. Many people, faced with anemia, start drinking beet juice actively, expecting quick results, and even perceive the change in urine color after consuming beets as a sign that their body is cleansing and hemoglobin is rising. However, when we turn to biochemistry and dietetics, this pretty and straightforward picture falls apart. The truth is that the color of a product has no direct relation to its ability to raise hemoglobin levels. Yes, some red foods, like red meat, are indeed rich in iron, particularly in a highly absorbable heme form. But beets and pomegranates, contrary to popular belief, contain relatively little iron. In 100 grams of beetroot, there is far less iron compared to, say, buckwheat or lentils. Furthermore, iron from plant sources, non-heme, is absorbed by the body much less effectively, requiring specific conditions for absorption, such as the presence of vitamin C. The process of raising hemoglobin levels is a complex and slow biochemical process. Iron must first be absorbed in the intestines, then enter the bloodstream, be transported to the bone marrow, and only there will new hemoglobin molecules be synthesized for red blood cells. This process takes not hours, but days and weeks. No food can increase hemoglobin instantly, and the characteristic red color of urine after consuming beets is not related to blood at all. It is caused by beta-cyanins, pigments found in beets that, in some people, are not fully broken down in the stomach and are excreted from the body unchanged. This is a completely harmless physiological characteristic, unrelated to kidney function or hemoglobin levels. The myth of red foods is an example of magical thinking, where external similarities are mistaken for internal connections. From myths about our bodies, we move on to those that shape our perceptions of fate itself. Myth number 21, the pendulum of fate and the law of balance. Everyone experiences tough times in life, work issues, personal setbacks, financial struggles. It can feel like everything is going awry. In these moments, we seek comfort, and one of the most popular forms is believing in the so-called law of balance. After a dark phase, light must follow. This idea is deeply rooted in folk wisdom and culture. We say, the night is darkest just before dawn, or, if it weren't for misfortune, there would be no happiness. This myth of cyclic luck gives us hope. It transforms our chaotic and unpredictable lives into an orderly system where suffering will inevitably be rewarded and setbacks are merely a prelude to future success. Believing in this is very comforting. It helps us endure tough times without falling into despair. We cling to this thought like a lifeline, trusting that fate or the universe will restore balance. However, if we scrutinize the world through the lens of statistics and probability, this comforting and beautiful myth falls apart. The truth is, there is no built-in law of the pendulum in life. Periods of good and bad luck are merely the results of random events and our own actions. Our minds tend to seek patterns where none exist. When something good follows a series of failures, we interpret this as confirmation of the law, overlooking the times when a dark phase was followed by an even darker one. This phenomenon is known as confirmation bias. Mathematically, each event is mostly independent of previous ones. If you flip a coin 10 times and get heads every time, that doesn't increase the odds of tails on the 11th flip. It remains 50%. Similarly, A streak of failures does not accumulate a debt of luck that the universe owes you. Yes, circumstances change over time, and we put in effort to overcome crises which might improve our situation. But this is the result of our actions and new random factors, not a working mystical law of balance. The myth of alternating black and white phases is a psychological defense mechanism that helps us cope with uncertainty. However, it can also be harmful if it leads us to passively wait for the good times to arrive, rather than actively working to solve our problems. And from this universal superstition, we will now move on to a much more localized, yet equally intriguing myth related to the ordinary threshold in our homes. Myth number 22. The invisible threshold at the door. Don't greet through the threshold. Don't pass anything over the threshold. These warnings are familiar to many of us from childhood. We heard them from our grandmothers and mothers, and even as adults, many of us instinctively step inside or invite our guests in before shaking hands or passing items. This superstition has become so ingrained in our daily lives that we follow it automatically, without questioning its origins. The myth suggests that breaking this rule will inevitably lead to arguments, discord, or some other misfortune. We believe it simply out of habit, because that's how it is done. It feels like a harmless tradition, a small ritual that costs nothing to observe, yet might protect us from bad luck. However, to understand the true meaning behind this prohibition, we must look back through the centuries, to a time when our ancestors' world was inhabited not only by people, but also by spirits. The truth hidden behind this superstition is far deeper and more mystical than just a fear of conflict. In ancient Slavic and many other pagan beliefs, the threshold of a home was not merely a piece of wood. It was a sacred boundary, the divide between two worlds. The inner space of the home was considered the realm of the living, a protected domestic space under the guardianship of household spirits. Everything beyond the threshold was the outside world, foreign and potentially hostile, a realm of spirits and the dead. The threshold was a place where these two worlds met. Furthermore, there existed a custom of burying the remains of ancestors under the threshold so they could protect their descendants from evil forces. Thus, the threshold was not only a boundary, but also a resting place and home for guardian spirits. Any action taken across the threshold, a handshake, passing an item, symbolically broke this boundary. It was believed to disturb the spirits of ancestors, violating the sacred frontier and opening the home to external evil forces. The conflict referenced by the modern superstition is merely a pale, rationalized echo of an ancient fear of disrupting the cosmic order and invoking the anger of the spirits guarding the home. So, when we today instinctively avoid greeting through the threshold, we unknowingly pay homage to the beliefs of our distant ancestors, for whom this simple architectural feature carried profound mystical significance. And from the boundary between worlds and our home, we turn to another messenger from the other side, whose arrival, according to superstition, heralds misfortune. Myth number 23. The feathered herald from the other world. Imagine a quiet room. Suddenly, a bird flies in through the open window. It flutters against the glass, darts around the ceiling, and, upon finding an exit, suddenly flies away. For the modern, rational individual, it's merely an annoying incident. But for someone raised in a traditional culture, this event carries a sinister meaning. One of the most common and frightening superstitions states, if a bird enters the house and then flies out, it signifies bad luck, misfortune, or even the departure of someone close. This myth evokes a primal, irrational fear. People who encounter it can live in anxious anticipation for weeks, believing that any negative event that follows is confirmation of a dreadful omen. The belief in this superstition is so strong because it appeals to our subconscious feeling that the world is full of signs and portents, and that nature can warn us about impending events. To understand the roots of this fear, we must dive again into the realm of ancient beliefs, where the boundary between the world of the living and the spirit world was thin and permeable. The truth is that this superstition is based on one of the oldest ideas about the soul and its afterlife journeys. In many cultures around the world, from ancient Egypt to Slavic tribes, it was believed that the soul of a deceased person could take the form of a bird. A bird, with its ability to fly and ascend to the sky, seemed the perfect embodiment of a soul freed from its earthly bonds. It served as a mediator between the earthly and heavenly realms, a messenger from beyond. Therefore, the sudden appearance of a bird in a home, in the sacred space of a family, was not seen as a coincidence, but as a visit from the soul of a deceased ancestor, or, more ominously, as a sign that death was nearby, sending its messenger to collect the soul of someone in the household. A bird flying in through a window symbolically breached the boundary between worlds, bringing with it news from the realm of the dead. Interestingly, the interpretation of the omen could vary depending on the type of bird. A dove might be seen as the soul of an ancestor coming in peace, while a tit or a sparrow was often perceived as a harbinger of doom. In the modern world, we have lost this mythological perspective, yet the irrational fear, a remnant of ancient beliefs, remains. From the mystical explanation of the behavior of birds, we move on to another mystical explanation of a natural phenomenon that once instilled terror in entire nations. Myth number 24, the celestial battle of angry gods. Dark clouds gather on the horizon. The sky splits with a blinding flash of lightning, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. For us, people of the 21st century, this is just a common atmospheric phenomenon that we studied in school. We know that it results from the difference in electrical potentials between clouds, or between a cloud and the ground. But for thousands of years of human history, this spectacle evoked not scientific curiosity, but sacred awe and terror. A great myth, common to hundreds of cultures, proclaimed that thunder and lightning are manifestations of divine wrath. It is the gods residing in the heavens who wage their battles, punish sinners, or simply demonstrate their indomitable power. The ancient Greeks saw this as Zeus the Thunderer hurling his thunderbolts from Olympus. Scandinavians heard the rumble of Thor's chariot and saw the sparks from the strikes of his hammer, Mjolnir. Slavs believed that it was the god Perun striking the unclean forces. This myth was not just a tale, it was a fundamental part of the worldview. It explained a frightening and unpredictable phenomenon, fitting it into an understandable system of divine justice and will. The truth revealed to us by science lacks the epic drama we often associate with myths. The debunking of this myth represents a triumph of human reason over primitive fear. Benjamin Franklin, with his famous kite experiment in 1752, proved the electrical nature of lightning. Today, we understand that within storm clouds, friction between water droplets and ice crystals causes a separation of charges. A positive charge builds up at the top of the cloud, while a negative charge accumulates at the bottom. When the potential difference becomes large enough, a giant electric discharge occurs. This is lightning. The thunder is simply a sound wave generated by the air rapidly expanding and exploding due to the extreme heat along the lightning's path. This is pure physics, devoid of any divine wrath. So why has this myth remained so important and persistent? Because it served a crucial social and psychological purpose. It provided people with an illusion of control. If a storm represents the anger of the gods, then it can be appeased with prayers, sacrifices, and righteous behavior. However, if it is a blind force of nature, then humanity stands powerless against it. The myth of thunder gods was a way to cope with existential dread in the face of nature's powers. Today, we manage this fear with lightning rods and weather forecasts. Yet each time we witness a storm, a trace of that ancient awe felt by our ancestors rises from the depths of our genetic memory, as they viewed the battles of celestial gods. From myths born in distant times, we now turn to the 20th century to explore legends crafted by pop culture. Myth number 25, the music linked by foreign words. In the late 1980s, a phenomenon known as Laskovy May burst onto the Soviet music scene. Their simple yet catchy songs echoed from every window and every kiosk. Among dozens of hits was one phrase that became a true symbol of the era, a password for an entire generation. Music has connected us. This line from the song of the same name by the group Mirage, performed by Tatiana Ovasenko, is so strongly associated with that time that it seems entirely unique, born from the creative struggles of its authors. The myth suggests that this brilliant and simple phrase is wholly original, an epiphany that struck the poet Valery Sokolov. It became so iconic that it is seen as something deeply authentic, a perfect reflection of the spirit of the time when music truly united millions. However, if we delve into the archives of Soviet pop music, we discover that this musical thread stretches back into the past. The truth is that the phrase "music has connected us" was not an original invention by the authors of Mirage. It was likely creatively reinterpreted and popularized by them, but the idea was already in the air. For example, just a few years prior, the Belarusian band Varasi had a song titled "Music for Everyone," which included the lines, "Let everything that connects us become music." If we dig a little deeper, we'll discover other, lesser-known examples of similar imagery in the poetry and songs of that era. Producer and creator of the band, Andrei Razin, who had a phenomenal instinct for hits, admitted that when creating songs for his projects, he and his team often drew inspiration from and combined ideas, phrases, and motifs from many other compositions, including Western ones. This was a common practice at the time. Thus, the phrase "music connects us" is not so much a unique insight, but rather a brilliantly crafted image that already existed in the cultural landscape, used at just the right moment. The band Mirage didn't so much invent it as they polished it and transformed it into a diamond, an absolute hit that overshadowed all previous references. This myth illustrates how a single successful phrase in pop culture can completely rewrite the narrative of its origin, remaining etched in the memories of millions as the one and only. Now, let's move from our musical hero to a cinematic one, whose name, as it turns out, has quite a humorous and down-to-earth origin. Myth number 26, the hero named after a dog. A hat, a whip, a worn leather jacket, and a deep fear of snakes. The image of Indiana Jones, the fearless archaeologist-adventurer, has become one of the most recognizable in film history. We've followed his adventures around the world, from Egyptian tombs to lost temples in the jungle. The name Indiana sounds so manly, so American, it seems perfectly suited for such a character. And here's where things get interesting. It is widely known that George Lucas, the creator of the character, named him after his dog, an Alaskan Malamute named Indiana. This fact is so amusing and unusual that it has spawned its own myth. The myth suggests that this dog was the main source of inspiration, that the entire concept of the character emerged from Lucas's desire to immortalize the name of his beloved pet. It feels almost like a genius whim. Why not name my hero after my dog? Now we must separate the truth from its simplified, anecdotal version. Yes, the character was indeed named after the dog. This fact has been confirmed by both Lucas and Steven Spielberg. In the film Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, there's even a humorous scene where Indiana's father, played by Sean Connery, says, "We named the dog Indiana." But this was merely the final detail, a cherry on top. The name, not the essence. The truth is that the prototypes for Indiana Jones were not dogs at all, but characters from cheap adventure film serials of the 30s and 40s that Lucas loved as a child. These were archaeologists, treasure hunters, and spies who found themselves in deadly traps every week, only to escape at the last moment. Lucas wanted to revive this genre, to create a modern hero in the spirit of old films. The character of Indiana Jones was meticulously crafted from the traits of these forgotten characters, as well as real-life adventurers and archaeologists from the early 20th century. The name itself was the subject of extensive debate. Initially, Lucas wanted to name him Indiana Smith, but Spielberg thought it sounded too similar to a character from one of his other films. That's when the option Jones came about. As for Indiana, that was just a playful personal touch from Lucas. So, the myth that a dog was the original inspiration distorts the actual creative process. The dog didn't inspire the creation of the character. It simply gave the character its name once he was nearly fully developed. Now, from a scene that turned out to be true, let's move on to another famous cinematic moment that, contrary to popular belief, was chillingly real. Myth number 27, the bloody gift for the unyielding producer. In the history of cinema, there are scenes that etch into our memories, provoking shock and awe. One such scene is in Francis Ford Coppola's film, The Godfather. Hollywood producer Jack Waltz refuses to cast Johnny Fontaine, the protege of Don Corleone, in his film. The next morning, he wakes up in his lavish bed and, horrified, discovers the bloody, severed head of his prized racehorse at his feet. This scene is so brutal and realistic that it immediately gave rise to numerous rumors and legends. The most persistent myth claims that a real horse's head was used in filming this scene, and that the crew had to take extreme measures to obtain it. Many viewers continue to debate whether it was a skillful prop or a shocking reality. This myth was fueled by the film's atmosphere, its grim realism, and rumors about the creator's connections to the real mafia. And this time, to the horror of animal rights advocates and sensitive viewers, the truth sided with the most brutal version. A real horse's head was indeed used in the scene. Director Francis Ford Coppola rejected the idea of using a prop from the very beginning, believing it would look unconvincing. He wanted the actor John Marley, who played the producer, to deliver an authentic reaction of horror. During rehearsals, a prop was placed in his bed, so the actor got accustomed to it. On filming day, unbeknownst to him, the prop was swapped for a real head. The production team found a dog food company and made arrangements with them. When one of the horses destined for slaughter was taken down, they asked for the head. No prize horse was killed specifically for the shoot. It was the head of an animal that was already destined for death. But the fact remains, the scream of terror we see on screen is the actor's genuine reaction upon encountering something so real under the sheet. This scene caused a huge scandal and protests from animal rights organizations, but Coppola stood firm on his artistic decision. So, in this case, the myth is more of a wish that it was just cinematic magic rather than harsh and shocking truth. Now, from one iconic piece of the 20th century, let's transition to another, a song that every person on the planet knows, but whose origins differ significantly from what we've come to believe. Myth number 28. The most famous song not written for a celebration. Happy Birthday to You. These 4 words and the simple melody are probably the most recognized musical creation on the planet. It is sung in every language, in every country, from huts in the jungle to presidential palaces. It has become an inseparable part of birthday celebrations, just like cake and candles. And of course, we all believe that this song was specifically written for this occasion. The myth suggests that some brilliant, yet possibly nameless author once created this simple and genius melody to congratulate people on their birthdays. It seems so inherently tied to the event that it's hard to imagine it having any other purpose. It is the very embodiment of celebration. However, copyright archives tell a very different story. This world-famous melody was actually born in the late 19th century, specifically in 1893, and its lyrics were completely different. 2 sisters from Kentucky, Patty and Mildred Hill, who worked in a kindergarten, composed a simple song for their students. It was called Good Morning to All and was intended to greet children in the classroom every morning. The melody remained the same, but the lyrics were, Good morning to you, good morning to you, good morning, dear children, good morning to all. The song quickly became popular among teachers and spread to other schools. How and when the words good morning were replaced with happy birthday is not precisely known. Likely, it happened spontaneously at some children's celebration. Someone had the idea to use this easy-to-remember melody to congratulate the birthday child. The new lyrics proved to be so successful that they instantly caught on and began their triumphant journey around the world. The lyrics of Happy Birthday to You were first published in print only in 1912, nearly 20 years after the original melody was created. Thus, the most famous congratulatory song in the world is, in essence, a folk remake of a mourning children's song. And from the myths of pop culture, we will return to the harsh realities of 20th century history and explore a painful topic that was long hidden behind the facade of official propaganda. Myth number 29. The Satiated Empire and the Silenced Hunger. In official Soviet historiography, the post-war period was portrayed as a time of heroic rebuilding of the country. The picture was this. The victorious people, united under the party's guidance, swiftly raised factories and cities from the ruins, and the collective farm system, despite its difficulties, provided the nation with bread. Against this backdrop, a powerful myth took root. In the USSR after the Second World War, unlike the starving 20s and 30s, there was no mass hunger. Yes, there were hardships, rationing, and food shortages, but the very idea of hunger as a widespread disaster that claimed lives was categorically denied. This myth was vital for maintaining the image of the Soviet system as effective and caring for its people. Any mention of mass starvation was deemed anti-Soviet propaganda. We believed it, as it was written in textbooks, spoken about on the radio, and there simply was no alternative information. However, hidden in closed archives and the memories of eyewitnesses was a different, horrifying truth. Between 1946 and 1947, the Soviet Union faced a brutal famine, the last mass famine in the country's history. The main cause was a severe drought that struck key grain-producing regions, Ukraine, Moldova, and central parts of Russia. Yet, this natural disaster was exacerbated by state policies. Despite the disastrous harvest, Stalin's leadership continued to seize grain from collective farms based on inflated quotas to feed cities and the army, and even exported it to Eastern European countries to maintain political influence. They took the last reserves from villages, condemning millions to a death by hunger. People ate wild herbs and tree bark, and there were even reports of cannibalism. The exact number of victims is still debated among historians, with estimates ranging from several 100,000 to 1.5 million people. This famine was carefully suppressed. Newspapers had barely a word on it, and in official documents, the cause of death was often listed as dystrophy or other diseases related to starvation. The myth of a well-fed post-war period was a lie intended to obscure the failure of agricultural policy and the government's ruthless attitude toward its own people. The truth about this famine became public only decades later when archives were opened, adding another scar to the body of our history. From the myth born of 20th century politics, we now travel back to ancient times, to a phrase we also use, often unaware of its true, rather down-to-earth origins. Myth number 30. The smell of money and imperial practicality. Money doesn't smell. Pecunia non olet. This saying has become a universal justification for profiting from dubious or less than noble sources. In our minds, it is strongly associated with the era of wild capitalism, with businessmen willing to do anything for profit, in a cynical world where morality takes a back seat to the sound of coins. The myth is that this phrase was born from modern times, a motto of stockbrokers and industrialists who coined it to excuse their dirty dealings. It sounds so contemporary, so pragmatic and cynical, that it seems like it could have been uttered somewhere on Wall Street or in the city of London, but not in the ancient world. To find the origin of this phrase, we need to embark on a time travel journey nearly 2,000 years back, to ancient Rome. It was spoken not by a 19th century capitalist, but by the Roman Emperor Vespasian, who ruled in the 1st century AD. Vespasian is remembered in history as a very practical and frugal ruler. After the Civil War and the extravagance of his predecessors, the imperial treasury was empty, and he sought every possible way to replenish it. One of his most unpopular but effective measures was the introduction of a tax on public toilets, known as urinae. His own son, the future Emperor Titus, was more fastidious and criticized his father for imposing such an unpleasant tax, essentially charging for waste. In response, as the historian Suetonius writes, Vespasian took a coin from the first profits made from this tax, held it up to his son's nose, and asked if it had a smell. Titus replied that it did not. But it comes from urine, the emperor concluded. It was in this context that the famous phrase was born. Thus, its original meaning was not so much cynical as it was extremely pragmatic. For Vespasian, there were no dirty or clean sources of state revenue. There was only money to be used for building roads, aqueducts, and rebuilding Rome after the fires. Over time, this phrase has taken on a different, darker meaning, while its true story is a humorous and instructive anecdote about a Roman emperor who proved that any means are fair for filling the treasury. And with this practical lesson from ancient history, we close our archives. But only for now. Ahead of us lie new myths, fresh revelations, and exciting journeys through the darkest and most astonishing corners of the past.